And I said to him, I go, don't you think you made a good plane? He goes, yeah. I go, how do you know? Because when I was practicing, it flew all the way across the room. I said, yeah. And then what happened when you actually were in the competition? He goes, well, I chose.
That is Mike Dunley, a second grade teacher, sharing a story about assessing an activity with second graders. And this is Mark Barnes on the Hack Learning podcast, and we are revisiting hacking the test because it seems like this is something that we can do constantly. So we'll call this Hacking the Test Part 2. So Mike Dunley, a renowned second grade teacher in New Jersey, has his kids are talking about creating something and then measuring how it works. It's sort of what we do in testing when you think about it, what we attempt to do at least. But what he wanted to do, instead of trying to measure learning, which really can't be done, is have his students perform to create something and to test how well it worked. So what they do is what you would picture second graders doing. They create airplanes. So they make paper airplanes, and they talk a lot about how this works. Exactly how can we measure how well our planes perform? In our last conversation on hacking the test, we talked about how to shift the way that we assess learning and to involve kids and to create this rich conversation. And I said a test is not assessment. So what Mike Dunley is doing with second graders, let me emphasize that, because one of the things that could really make an impact on education in the K-12 world is to begin these best practices in assessment right from the beginning of a child's school career. So instead of labeling them, putting a percentage or a number or a grade on the work, what if we have these rich conversations about how we assess our performance? So let's listen to what Mike says, how he had this conversation about not only the activity, but about assessing the work. And he had the conversation with 7-year-olds.
Awesome. And then I said, okay, can anyone else find a problem if we all do it at the same time? And a little girl raises her hand. She goes, well, what if a plane would have flown really far but it got hit and crashed by another one? And I'm like, okay, how can we resolve this? So it goes back and forth. And I was telling the kids how we really have to design an intelligent test to make sure that we're measuring the right way to find out who made the best plane, define what the best plane is. And it was a very cool conversation. And so then I said, well, can we make sure that
so
we pick the right one? And someone said, well,
let me turn Mike off here. Not the Mike for the podcast, but Mike Dunley. So what happens then is they have this discussion and they make some decisions on what will decide if their planes that they have built are successful or not. And ultimately, they decided the planes need to go far. They need to travel far because that's what planes do. If you get on a plane from Cleveland and you're going to California, well, you want to end up in California. So the kids understand this and they say, well, we need to have our planes go far. So they go outside and they run the test. And as we learned in the open, they're looking at this and they are deciding now how I've made a plane and it seems like it's working well, but now I have to go and I have to give it this test, this one-time, one-off test to see if it performs up to standards. And when you think about it in the testing world, whether it's standardized test, a high-stakes test, or a test that a teacher creates for an end-of-unit exam, what we're doing is we're using the one-off. So we put in a whole bunch of work, and then we're going to decide how much you know, how well you perform in this one-off event, which could be 30 minutes or an hour, or in a high-stakes test, maybe 2.5 hours. So Mike's kids decide that their test is to fly the planes. Boy, isn't it a whole lot better to actually look at performance and to talk about it? But there's still an issue with this. So let's find out what happens.
The whole thing happens. They make their planes. 2 kids were really successful in their practice throws, and then when they went to actually, put their competition flight in, both planes nosedived. And I said to them, don't you think you made a good plane? He goes, yeah. I go, how do you know? Because when I was practicing, it flew all the way across the room. I said, yeah. And then what happened when you actually were in the competition? He goes, well, I chose. I said, that's right. I go, just like testing. Sometimes you guys might bomb a test, but you really know it. And, you have to remember that you still, even though your plane crashed, you've got a great plane. I said, you have to remember that when you take a test, that the test doesn't decide how smart you are. The test decides how you did that day. I said, so...
The test doesn't decide how smart you are. The test decides how you did that day. What a crucial piece of information that I think a lot of people really know, but for some reason we don't accept. And I lay most of the blame for this on a bureaucracy run by publishing lobbies that create testing instruments, multi-billion-dollar businesses. And there's this whole trickle-down effect now. They go to the policymakers and they say, hey, we'll give you this tool. And then they say, okay, great, we'll purchase the tool. And then they create items to help teachers teach to the test. And then it all boils down to this one big, one-off event to decide what does a child know. And also, and this is really damaging as well, we then decide how well did the teacher perform. And unfortunately, this is an attitude that is carried into the classroom and outside of high-stakes testing. In education, a lot of teachers still use the one-off version to measure learning. I had my air quotes on there. You couldn't see them because you can't measure learning. We can measure performance. Mike and his 7-year-olds could measure how far their planes flew. You get a tape measure. It's easy. But did that measure what they'd learned? As he asked the child, did you make a good plane? Yeah. And I did a lot of test runs before that weren't the official test. And my plane flew really far. And then when it came time to perform under the lights, one of his kids says, I choked. Wow, what an admission for a 7-year-old. I choked. And that happens. Think of how often kids choke on the test and they really know something. Think how often a kid doesn't value the test at all, says this doesn't say anything about me, and they mail in the effort. The one-off, standalone test has got to stop. As we said in part 1 of Hacking the Test is not assessment. What Mike Dunley's doing with his second graders, his 7-year-olds, is assessment. It's a conversation. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? What are the stumbling blocks? I mean, one of his kids says, well, if the planes fly at the same time, they might crash into each other. Planes crash, right? Well, that's a problem. So how do we fix that? What do we do about it? And then we go out and we try to perform based on what we've created, and we say, well, it's not working. It doesn't work. Well, that's not the end of learning. Well, let's go back. Where'd the mistake happen? What can we relearn? And then let's do it again. Because you know what? In the real world, and we love to talk about the real world in education, in the real world, when the plane crashes, tragically, we don't stop sending planes out. We go back, we find out what was wrong, and we fix it. And we need to get to a point where we do this in school. So go back into the classroom tomorrow and take a cue from Mike Dunley. What can you do with your students, no matter what grade you teach or subject you teach, how old your kids are? How can you involve them in this rich, incredible conversation about learning? Think about that. Head back to the classroom and make it happen, because you and your students are going to love it. Hey, we continue this conversation on Twitter at #HackLearning, on the Hack Learning group on Facebook. And as always, there's so much to read about these amazing topics in the Hack Learning series. Check out hacklearningbooks.com. See you next time.